When it comes to writing characters, Hirohiko Araki is one of the best mangakas for the job, being able to pull off both lovable good boys on the same level of quality with monstrously evil villains. And he's also been finding a nice middle ground in between good and evil as he goes on. Araki also has one of the best ranges when it comes to characters, and you see this shine through best when Araki gets to write real scum of the earth villains. Someone who you just want to see get what's coming to them. And one of the best versions of this was the original bastard himself, Steely Dan, and his stand, Lovers. Steely Dan is one of the agents of Dio, working cleanup for Dio and taking out any traitors that may be among his agents. And the reason he appears in the story is to take out Enya the Hag, who's been kidnapped by the Crusaders, along with attempting to take out the Crusaders himself in Pakistan. And on the surface, Steely Dan seems like he's just another stand user of the week, something that Stardust Crusaders is quite well known for, though his cowardly methods of fighting really made Steely Dan stand out as a memorable antagonist for the series. Though before we get too into that, we should understand the meaning behind his name. Steely Dan gets his name from the American rock band founded in 1972, that being Steely Dan, which is one of the most important bands in all of music and actually has influenced Araki's writing before Part 3, with Part 2's MacGuffin, the Redstone of Asia. Along with this, it would go on to influence more things in Steel Ball Run and Jojolion, but when working on Part 3, Araki had to find a way to make Steely Dan the character own up to such an important reference in music in his name, starting first by modeling Dan himself after one of the founding members of Steely Dan, Donald Fagen, as the two have similar facial structures and similar long hair for the time. But also he made sure to give Steely Dan one of the most iconic moments in JoJo itself, one that wouldn't be topped for 8 years past its origin, and would cement the character in the history of the series forever. This of course being Steely Dan got one of the longest beatdowns in all of the series, even longer than some main antagonists. Though Steely Dan's own localization name actually has a funny history as well. You see, originally in the localization for Part 3, Steely Dan had his name changed to Rubber Soul, which is of course based on the Beatles album of the same name. Though, in the future publications of Part 3, that name was given to the Yellow Tempest stand user, and Steely Dan needed a new localization name. Thus they gave him the name Dan of Steel, which was selected both as a possible reference to the Rock Around the World article about the band Steely Dan, which describes the band's history, but also sort of a joke playing on the fact that Man of Steel is the nickname for the brave and powerful Superman, which the Dan of Steel would be basically the opposite of. Though now you know where the character of Steely Dan got its name from. Do you know where the band Steely Dan got its name from? Well, you see, the two founding members were big fans of literature, so they decided to name their revolutionary band after a steam-powered, piston-charged, strap-on dildo from the novel Naked Lunch. Which leads me to Steely Dan's own stand, Lovers. Lovers is a microscopic humanoid stand which has its design based on a mixture of a tick, a fly, and funny enough, Johnny Five from the 1986 movie Short Circuit. The reason for this being is Araki wanted a blend of organic and robotic parts for the design of the stand. This is because Lovers is supposed to represent an embodiment of the reverse Lovers Arcana, as a fly and a tick are both pests that parasitically feed off someone else, a lot like the relationship issues described in the reverse Lovers, and a robot is unable to contemplate the feeling of love, which describes relationship issues in the reverse Lovers as well. But the size of the stand is kind of important for it as well, as Lovers isn't intended to be a combat-suited stand. It's actually more suited for assassinations and reconnaissance, and this is because its ability favors more stealthy assaults, as that major ability is Share the Pain. How Share the Pain works is Lovers enters a target's brain and connects itself to the brainstem, an attempt to manipulate the brain functions, focusing specifically on manipulating a target's pain receptors, so that whenever Steely Dan takes damage, the stand will feel it and transfer that exact same pain onto a target, with the twist being that with the Lovers controlling the pain receptors, all the pain the target feels will be amplified tenfold. So for example, when Steely Dan cracks his knuckles, a target may feel as if their hands and knuckles are being broken. And having a severed limb doesn't prevent you from actually feeling pain where that limb would be originally. As long as Steely Dan has the limb, he can make you feel phantom pain where your missing limb is, as seen when he makes Joseph's prosthetic hand hurt. This ability allows Steely Dan to force someone into a toxic but somewhat intimate connection where he basically holds them hostage, all while he plants his real attack in the target's head, as even though it's not actually part of Lover's moveset, Steely Dan was trusted with a multitude of Dio's vampiric spores, which once fully grown, will kill its host. And with Lovers, Steely Dan is able to scrape away brain cells and feed them to the spore, allowing it to develop rapidly, becoming fully grown in 10 minutes. Though feeding Dio's spore isn't the only thing that Lovers can do with that residue left behind from brain cells. It can also create disguises. Along with this, it's also able to create clones of itself which it can hide among and attack people from their blind spots. These clones are also fully controllable and are able to hurt stands, though if they're destroyed, they actually don't affect Steely Dan, so they're the perfect kind of clones. But Lovers also rarely gets to use this ability, as it requires his target, or the friends of the target, to shrink their stands down to microscopic size as well. Now, Lovers gets its name from the Lover's Arcana from the Tarot deck, though much like all the villains in Part 3, the stand and the stand user specifically represent the reverse lovers, which, when it comes up in tarot readings, means that a person will suffer from some form of relationship issues, infidelity, and being forced into a broken relationship. It's also a signal that someone is acting out of sync with their natural rhythm. These readings are obviously reflected in how Steely Dan uses his stand, as he forces people to act or feel different than they normally would. Along with this, the physical connection between Steely Dan and his targets is obviously a representation of that broken relationship, as a relationship is often described as a physical relation between two people. Steely Dan forces people into this said relationship against their will, by literally getting into their head, which is almost a textbook example of a relationship with issues or a broken relationship. Also, Steely Dan's own cowardly nature mixed with his scummy personality, masked by his semi-good looks, is a near walking and talking embodiment of the reverse Lover's ugly on the inside readings. But the Lover's Arcana isn't the only thing that Lover's ability reflects. In fact, it actually references the 1987 movie Interspace, which is a movie about Tuck Pendleton testing out a historical device, a miniaturization ray, that is being used on a submersible ship, with the intention of injecting the ship into a test animal to see if they can control it by manipulating its brainstem. Though due to some shenanigans, this sub gets injected into a unsuspecting body of a man named Jack Putter. And once inside, the ship can manipulate parts of Jack's body to make him do whatever Tuck wants him to, and the two need to work together to save each other. The concept of this movie is very similar to that of the Lover's Arc, but with the twist of the person in control being the antagonist. And Araki likely picked this idea because he wanted a stand user who wasn't a traditional fighter, but more so someone who would force the group into dealing with a situation very differently than they did with any other stand user. Hence why the fight starts with Jotaro attacking Steely Dan in the same way that he does any other stand user, and it instantly backfiring, reinforcing the idea that they can't address this like they address every other issue in the series. And Araki knew making the readers watch this smug prick parade around and embarrass Jotaro, the calm and collected Clint Eastwood of the series, would easily get under their skin, causing them, over time, to slowly build up the same hatred as Jotaro towards Steely Dan. Araki, in a sense, was building a bastard, different than all the other enemies we've seen throughout the entirety of Stardust Crusaders, all to make his defeat unforgettable and seriously cathartic, as we see this man get the ever-loving shit beat out of him over 3.5 pages of glorious beatdown, all delivered by the man he was embarrassing the entire time, which was then later translated into a 20-second beatdown in the anime. And this beatdown was legendary for the time, longer than any single beatdown in the series prior, and Araki knew not to try to top this in the next part right away. He in fact waited 8 years and let the moment ferment and solidify Steely Dan as a significant and important character in JoJo history. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like it in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MediNotTheBadGuy. And if you want to feel the benefits of the upright Lover's Arcana, well, you can do so by getting yourself a copy of Shimonetta at buyshimonetta.com. Pick yourself up a copy and you'll understand the true meaning of love.